Hey everyone, my name's Corel, and today we're going to be taking a deeper look into missiles. More specifically, we're going to be taking a look at the components that you can put on missiles. So in order to start taking a look at that, I've built these three different size missiles here. We've got a small on the left, a medium in the middle, and a large on the right, and these all have 4 components on them. That's enough to start producing a small missile, so we're going to go ahead and dig right on into how you set up these missiles. So the first thing to note here is the overall user interface. I've got an editor here. This lets me add components to the missile. I've got a save load tab, and this lets me save missiles in various different slots and load them from the slots down here. So I can, if I have a missile design that I like, I can save it up here. You can see it tells me how long this missile is in this little number here. And then once I've got a missile template saved, I can load it back here. And you can see that if I don't have the correct length of missile to be loaded in this slot, then it just gives me kind of a red background there and red text, and I can't actually load that missile in the slot because it's the wrong size. Moving on, we've got the stats window over here on the right. This gives us basic information about the missile, including things like its health, its reload time, its ammo cost, its ammo usage per second, its detection range, its lifetime, the interceptor range. This is for missile interceptors specifically. This firepower tab in general is going to give you information about how powerful that missile is, what kind of damage it's going to do, how much damage it's going to do, how many warheads per second it can deliver, that sort of information. There's a flight characteristics tab here that's going to tell you, and this is pretty much static information here, it's going to tell you the maximum speed at sea level at 300 meters altitude, the turn rate at sea level, the turn rate at 300 meters altitude, how much fuel you contain on this missile, how much fuel this missile burns per second, and how long this missile can fly for under its own thrust. So those are consistent. They aren't going to change based on what components you put on the missile very much. There's a few things that can show up there or disappear depending, but we'll get into that later. The detection tab down here, we can see this doesn't have anything right now, but if I put some sort of tracker on this missile, the detection tab will let me know what type of detection this missile is using, and how sensitive that is, what types of things it's going to be able to track, and how well, and all that sort of thing. Moving back over to the left here, we have the missile editor, and this has 3 settings that are going to always be there for every missile. We've got warhead arming delay, which is how long the missile has to fly in time before the warheads will actually arm. So in other words, by default it's 1 second. If I launch a missile, the warheads aren't actually going to be armed until 1 second into the missile's flight time. So if this missile hits something, it's not actually going to explode or deal any damage until at least 1 second has passed since launch. There's also guidance activation delay. That's the amount of time before the guidance on the missile kicks in. So that gives it enough time to clear the launch tube before it starts trying to turn, usually. And then there's thrust before locking. This is a relatively new setting. It basically lets you slow a missile way down, in fact, up to 50% down, I believe is the minimum amount there. And what that does is, until you get lock on the vehicle, you want your missile to be more maneuverable, and you want it to be generally slower so that it has more opportunities to acquire a target. So lowering the thrust before locking leaves you with a slower missile that then takes a little bit of time to not fire its thrusters at full speed before it locks onto a target, and that lets it turn faster, that lets it get a good target lock on a target, and then the jets kick in. Down at the very bottom here, we've also got a copy to all matching launch pads. If you have launch pads of the same size and the same length on the same launcher, this button will copy the current missile design to all of them. So if I had, say, another one of these little tiny launchers right next to it here, and I hit copy to all matching launch pads, it would copy from this one to that other small launcher, but not to the medium or large missiles, despite the fact that those have the same number of components. Alright, with all of the user interface out of the way, let's go ahead and start digging into the components. Now the thruster and the nose cone, these go back to front, so the thruster is at the top, the nose is at the bottom. The thruster and nose are the most defining characteristics of your missile, so what's in the back and what's in the front are going to pretty much determine what your missile is capable of and what it's going to do. There are some various other rules that break that, or components that break that rule, rather, but those are on a case-by-case basis, and they're not really consistent. So we're going to first off look at the thrusters. So looking at our first component here, we have the short-range thruster. A short-range thruster is a high-speed thruster that will burn out of fuel very quickly, and it chews through fuel very quickly, and it has a very hard max burnout time. Now what that means here, I've got this max duration setting if I'm editing this component, and that is set to 5 seconds maximum. I can turn that down, I cannot turn it up. What that means is that this short-range thruster will only ever burn for a maximum of 5 seconds. It doesn't matter if I have more than 5 seconds of fuel on it, I'm still only going to get 5 seconds of thrust. So the short-range thruster is very limiting in that respect, and it's also limiting in that I cannot turn this up or down. It is only on or off. However, I can start a delay on the missile, or I can set a start delay on the missile. And what this is going to do is this will delay the initial firing of that thruster for, say, 2 seconds. If I have missile ejectors on this launch pad, and those were able to launch me at, let's say, 250 meters a second, and let's ignore the flight characteristics over here for a moment, and let's just go ahead and say that I have 200 meters a second of maximum flight speed. So if I'm giving it an initial velocity of 250 meters a second, adding thrust to that is not going to drive me over that max speed. Essentially, I can never exceed that max speed regardless of how much thrust I apply. So the short-range thruster is going to be firing right off the bat if I have 0 start delay, and it's just going to be wasting fuel and wasting burn time trying to fire when it can't actually affect the speed of the missile at all. So if I have an initial velocity of 250 meters a second and a max speed of 200 meters a second, I want to set my start delay such that the missile doesn't actually start firing until I drop below 200 meters a second. So I want to set up that start delay and just make sure that I'm not wasting fuel or wasting burn time by burning too soon. So that's the short-range thruster, high velocity, much higher than is available through the variable thruster, and very high fuel consumption. The variable thruster, by contrast, has an extra setting here for ramp time, an extra setting for thrust per second, and a start delay. So the start delay works like we saw before. This does not have a max burn time setting because this thruster can fire forever. It does not have a maximum time that it can fire. It just has, the maximum lifetime of the missile, obviously, is its cap. So we've got a ramp time. By default, that's 1 second. That's usually pretty good to start with. It's got a thrust per second. And again, that default's all right. It can be adjusted up or down. And then we've got the start delay. The variable thruster can consume less fuel if you turn the thrust per second down, or more fuel if you turn it up. So you can adjust your fuel consumption per second here. And let's just go ahead and there's a little tuning you can do with this. So let's go ahead and go through that process. I am looking at a small missile here. A small missile has a maximum lifetime of 10 seconds by default. I have one fuel tank on here. That has 1250 fuel on it. At a burn rate of 100 per second, that gives me 12.5 seconds of burn time. I can't use 12.5 seconds of burn time because this missile only exists for 10 seconds. So I can definitely afford to turn this up. More importantly, I can afford to turn this up to the point where I have 9.5 seconds of thrust duration because I have a ramp time of 1 second, which means that on average I'm going to be firing at 50% of my thrust for 1 second. So I'm going to be using 0.5 seconds of thrust over the course of 1 second, and therefore I will have 10.5 seconds of thrust, if that makes sense, if I set my thrust duration to 10 seconds. So if I turn up my thrust per second so that I have 9.5 seconds of total thrust duration, then I will actually burn out my fuel at exactly the same time the missile expires. So you can even increase this a little bit further if you want to fudge the numbers a little bit, because odds are if the missile runs out of fuel, it's still going to have enough velocity to connect if it was originally going to do so at the very end of its lifespan. You're not really shaving off anything by going down to, say, like 9 seconds here. Another thing that's worth noting here, the detection range in air with this variable thruster. The more thrust I give this thing, the higher the detection range for the missile. So that's kind of a counterbalance there, because the faster the missile is able to travel, the farther away you're going to be able to detect it. The short-range thruster here, because of its increased thrust and fuel consumption, has a much higher detection range. So that's another counterbalancing downside to the short-range thruster. Third thing we've got here is the torpedo propeller. This is a thruster that only works underwater. It can't give you a very high top speed, but it's very fuel efficient, and it has all of the same settings as your variable thruster with exactly the same implications. One important thing of note, though, because torpedoes are always slower than missiles, one thing that the developers have done is to, whenever you have a torpedo propeller as your thruster, they double the lifetime of the missile. So that's very useful. It's a very nice way of kind of countering the fact that torpedoes, by their very nature, are slow. Another trick we can pull here, you might have noticed if we have the short-range thruster or the variable thruster, we get this second slot down here. That is a secondary torpedo propeller, and it has all the same settings as a variable thruster or a torpedo propeller. It acts exactly like a torpedo propeller. The only thing that's going on here that's interesting is that I have both a thruster and a propeller now. I'm paying for it by having 2 components on the back instead of 1, but this missile can now travel underwater as well as it can above water. Moving right along, next up we are starting with the nose components. And first off is the active radar seeker. You might notice I mouse over these components. These have various different health values. The health values indicate how durable a component is and how much it contributes to the total health of the missile. So this active radar seeker here has a health of 30. That will mean that the health of 30 is added to the total stat of the missile. Active radar seeker here is basically going to behave like an active radar detector on a vehicle. That's one of the reasons we covered detection before we covered missiles. These detection components on missiles behave almost exactly the same way as the detection components on a vehicle. So active radar seeker, as you might expect, can be seen by a passive radar detector. That means if a target vehicle has a passive radar detector on it, and I use an active radar seeker missile, I can always see this missile with that passive radar detector. As long as the radar seeker is pinging that vehicle, it will be able to see my missile. That is a downside to this, because it means that the detection range in air is actually a lie. The active radar seeker will be detected long before this detection range. Same thing applies for sonar, which we'll get into later. But for now, the active radar seeker, you can see here this will detect radar signals. So things that radar is good at detecting, this missile will be also good at detecting. That means that things that are large, that have a lot of exposed flat components, will return a very large radar cross-section and are very good targets for active radar seekers. Now, the downside to radar seekers, you cannot control these very well. All missiles with active detection on them are going to have some sort of algorithm that governs how they track targets or what target they lock onto. So in the case of radar, we have a maximum detection angle of 180 degrees. That is a perfect detection angle. That means we can detect anything at any angle. We've got a minimum signal strength threshold, which means that a vehicle that returns less than 100 signal strength in the radar signature will get completely ignored. And we've got a decoy missile signal strength, randomly reduced to 10% to 100% of its value. So a decoy missile will randomly be reduced to somewhere between 10% and 100% effective. And we have a signal strength modifier based on range. And we've got a target priority modifier based on 0, half, and max angle. So essentially, what this target priority modifier is doing is it's a multiplier of how much priority a target will get based on how close to straightforward that target is. Whereas the signal strength modifier is a modifier that's based on how far away that target is. So the algorithm that determines which target the radar is going to pick is going to weight targets based on their size and radar signature, and any decoy missiles in the area and their signal strength that gets randomly computed when the missile is launched, along with the distance to that target and the angle that we're going to have to turn in order to reach that target. That's fairly consistent amongst most types of detection, or active detection, I should say. But the active radar seeker is unique in this in that it can detect absolutely everything, and that makes it very difficult to control. Because even though I can give the missile a suggestion that it should probably aim at a specific target by launching it straight at that target using, say, a turret, I cannot guarantee that the missile will lock onto that. Because if that target is particularly small or evasive or just doesn't have a good radar return signature or is a long ways off, odds are this missile is going to pick a larger, closer target, or one that is closer to its center of turn. There's not a whole lot I can do about that. Another problem with this is that the largest vehicles tend to be the ones with the best missile defenses. So radar seekers have a tendency to home in on large things, and large things, almost by definition, are going to be best defended against this type of weapon. So you've got kind of a double whammy there of bad things happening when you use active radar seekers. But active radar seekers can aim in any direction, which can save you a component slot or two, and in general are very hard to fool. So yeah, there's ups and downs to these. Moving on to the next component, we have the infrared seeker. Now, an infrared seeker is a heat seeker. Like we discussed with the detection tutorial, it's going to home in on hot things. Unlike the detection tutorial, however, an infrared seeker will specifically seek out components on a target vehicle that emit heat. Now, what this means is an infrared seeker will look at the current side of a vehicle that it can see. If you're approaching a vehicle from the front, it will look at the front of that vehicle and say, what's the hottest component that I can see? And it will home in on that. So if I have a forwards-facing jet that I'm using to travel backwards on, say, a standoff gunship, the infrared seeker is going to see that thruster and it's going to go straight for it. That is a very useful thing because it means that I can start impairing a target's mobility. I can start shaving off its ability to do various things. A lot of critical from the depths components emit heat. Shields emit heat. Engines emit heat. Engine exhaust, rather. Like I said, jet thrusters emit heat. So infrared seekers are going to find those components, they're going to seek them out, and they're going to blow them up. And that can be nothing but good for you. However, heat can be spoofed. You can route engine exhaust to a point on the vehicle where destroying that exhaust pipe is going to do nothing to the overall function of the vehicle. I can put decoys on a vehicle that produce heat. I can throw out flares with other missiles. I can do all sorts of things that are going to obscure heat and make it less likely that the infrared seeker will lock onto something useful. So this can be both a pro and a con. Similarly to the radar detector, we have a minimum signal strength threshold, we've got the decoy modifiers. All these modifiers are pretty much the same as radar. The only thing that's different here is the maximum detection angle. This is 60 degrees, not 180, so this means we're only going to get a 120 degree cone, which is a forward-looking cone. So you want to make sure that your missiles are roughly pointed towards the target before you fire this, or you're going to need to use a one-turn component. Moving right along, we have next up the single pixel IR seeker. This is exactly the same as the IR seeker, but you'll notice there's a minimum detection angle, and there's also a maximum detection angle that is much lower. However, the minimum signal strength threshold is also half that of a regular IR seeker. the decoy missile signal strength is randomly reduced to 15 to 30%, not 10 to 100%. And the single pixel IR seeker cannot use anything to further lower a decoy missile signal strength. However, it has signal strength reduction built in, so you don't really need to worry about that so much. You've also got the usual signal strength modifier based on range and angle. And so really what this is saying is if I have a target straight in front of me with this missile, I can't see it. Which means that if something else off to the side is also emitting heat but a lesser amount of heat, and I can't see this thing straight in front of me, I'm going to start turning towards the thing that I can see until the thing that's hotter right in front of me loses or gets to the point where I can see it. It's outside that 3-degree frontal cone. So then I'm going to turn back to that because it's obviously the hottest thing around. And I still want to go for that target. So single pixel IR seekers tend to have kind of a wobbly flight pattern, especially if there are multiple targets around in the same general direction. They also have to be fairly tightly controlled. You have to get them pretty close to straight at their target when you initially fire them in order to get them to lock on. This maximum detection angle is really pretty restrictive. So for all those downsides, you in return have something that just by default mostly ignores decoys and is really hard to spoof, and there's just generally a few really good characteristics about this. You'll also note that the health on this is 75, the regular infrared seeker is 30, so I have more than double the health on the single pixel IR seeker. Additionally, and this is kind of a metagame thing, the single pixel IR seeker uses a much lighter algorithm for the From the Depths engine, so it's much faster to compute. And that's maybe not a huge deal for some of you, but if you are firing off hundreds of missiles and you're wanting to use infrared seekers, consider the single pixel IR seeker instead because it's going to tie up less of your processor. Moving along, we have next up the torpedo sonar. And this is basically sonar. I mean, it's underwater radar. There's really not a whole lot to it. The only odd thing here is you have this maximum detection angle that behaves very much like the infrared seeker, and the health is that of the single pixel IR seeker. So we have a fairly durable component here that will not really track very well until it's pointing roughly at a target. All that aside, the characteristics of this are very similar to how radar operates above the water, but sonar only operates underwater. So this is very good for torpedoes, not so great for anything outside the water. So our maximum detection angle here and all of this sort of thing is not going to be useful if the seeker can't actually see the target, so you are never going to hit an airplane with a torpedo sonar unless that airplane has been already submersed. Next in line we have the laser designator receiver. This is kind of a special one. This goes back to, if you remember back out here in the missile components, we have the laser emitter. And that can be steered by either the player or the AI, and it will laze or point at the target. And so the laser designator receiver looks at that point on the target. It just looks at where the laser is on the target. So if your AI is aiming at a specific block on the target vehicle, the laser designator receiver will attempt to home in on that specific block that the AI is targeting. So that can be excellent. The laser designator receiver can also not be spoofed. So this detection down here, this whole detection block is null and void because it really doesn't matter. There's nothing else that can go into this other than, is there a laser pointing at the target? Now, worth noting, there's some settings on this. We can aim at our lasers, we can aim at our vehicle's lasers, or we can aim at our team's lasers. That means that I can aim at only lasers attached to this specific missile system. I can aim at any laser operated by a missile system on this vehicle, or I can aim at any laser operated by any missile system on any of my team's vehicles. And how this prioritizes targets now is that it will look at the nearest physical target to the missile. So if I have a target that is 1 inch behind me back here and is just hovering right behind this vehicle, and I have a target that's 100 meters out in front of this vehicle, this will always attempt to hit the vehicle that is 1 meter behind me if that has a laser pointing at it. So I want to be very careful aiming at my whole team's lasers, because it's very frequent for a missile to not be able to hit its target reliably with the laser designator receiver if you are aiming at team lasers and the team laser happens to designate a target that is close but not within an easy turn arc. So be pretty careful about that. Also worth noting, the laser designator receiver will only work with the missile laser emitter. Any other laser components are ignored, so don't even think about trying to use a damage laser to spot for this thing. Additionally, we have one countermeasure to this: smoke. This laser emitter is completely blocked by smoke. If there is smoke in between me and the target vehicle, this will not work. I will get no designation out of this, and if I try and fire this missile, it's going to fly straight. It's going to do nothing. It will not even attempt to lock onto the vehicle until that missile laser emitter has gotten out of the smoke. If you're considering using smoke as a laser defense on your vehicle, do not use laser designator receivers. It will not work. If you're using any sort of a smoke shell to protect yourself from offensive lasers, do not use this. It will not end well. Next up, we have the Missile Interceptor Head. This is a combination warhead and guidance system, and what this will do is cause the missile to seek any enemy nearby detected missiles. And the missiles that it will seek will be determined by your AI based on the number of interceptors that are going to be required to destroy that enemy incoming missile. So that's a lot of stuff going on, but basically if you use these missile interceptors, you are guaranteeing that this missile is going to seek and destroy enemy missiles that are identified by your vehicle's AI as being high priority targets. You can try and attach warheads to this, might help. You can try and attach decoy components to this, and that will likely help. But in general, with missile interceptors, you want a fairly short missile because you want to be able to fire this quickly in order to intercept enemy incoming volleys. So you usually want to try and shoot for as few components as possible on your missile interceptors. Moving on, the next component in line is the Shaped Charge Head. Now, the Shaped Charge Head is a new component. This didn't exist up until really a few days or a week ago. And what this does is this behaves exactly like the APS system, if any of you are familiar with that already. This immediately attempts to use all explosives attached to this warhead, and it will try and create spalling or fragmentation particles inside the vehicle based on the innermost layer of armor inside the vehicle. So if I try and shoot this and hit a vehicle on the outside, say on the front of a vehicle, it will try and penetrate that armor without necessarily destroying the armor. It will try and create a bunch of particles inside the vehicle to destroy squishy components inside. So that's a great way of kind of getting around the whole armor mitigation thing that missiles tend to run into. So very useful there. However, there are some downsides to it. This is occupying the nose slot, and you'll notice that a lot of our seeking components occupy this nose slot. So we're essentially giving up our ability to use radar seeking, infrared seeking, or laser designator receiver, or a torpedo sonar. None of those will work if we're using a Shaped Charge Head. So there's definitely a downside that comes along with that power. Next up, we have our final component, the Thumper Head. Now this has 300 health. Yeah, that's huge. A lot of these have 30. A couple of them have 75. This one has 300. 300 is huge. So what this is doing is massively increasing the health of the missile. However, there's also another factor here. If I go ahead and just put a couple fuel tanks on there and go back to an active radar seeker. So you can see with this missile's firepower, I have no warheads on this missile. However, I'm doing a little bit of impact damage per meter per second at 20 AP. The AP is the thump, or this impact AP is from the thump damage it caused by the missile. That's just from the missile running into something. If I have a long metal stick running into your vehicle, it's gonna do something. It's a metal stick running into you at a high rate of speed. So the faster that is going here, the more damage we do, and that's done always at a constant AP or armor piercing value. So what the thumper head does is it increases that damage per meter per second. So it also has very low drag, and low drag components on the nose or the front of the missile mean that that missile can travel much quicker. So you get a little bit of extra speed out of this, and you're also converting that speed into extra damage. And that is generally pretty useful. You're not going to get as much damage out of this as you would out of a regular warhead, but it comes with some upsides to make up for that. However, again, this is not a tracking system. This gives me no guidance whatsoever, and it's occupying a slot where most of our guidance type components exist. So kinda limiting. Moving along to the fuel and control column, I've got fins. Those are my first component here. These are basic guidance maneuvering systems. So if I have guidance on my missile, I need fins on it in order to actually turn the missile. Guidance without fins does nothing because I can't turn. You need to be able to turn in order to actually hit stuff that your guidance finds for you. Kind of important. So fins are more or less how you do that. Important thing of note about fins. The further towards the back or the front of the missile, the more the fins are going to affect your turn rate. In order to demonstrate this here, I'm going to extend this by, let's just say, 2 blocks. And let's go ahead and grab a regular rail gantry. So I've got now a much longer missile, and I've got 1 fin at the back. This gives me 17 degrees per second of turn rate, which is actually really bad, but ignoring that for now, if I was to, let's just go ahead and fill all of this out with reinforced bodies, since that is what most of our components are. So now we've got 0 degree turn rate per second. 1 fin at the back gives me 17 degrees per second. That's great. 1 fin near the middle of the missile is going to give me 3.4 degrees per second. That's terrible. It's less than a quarter of the other turn rate. So it's basically non-existent. This missile will barely be able to turn with a fin here. However, fins also induce a lot of drag. So there's an ideal placement for these. High drag components towards the front of a missile affect the speed of the missile more than high drag components towards the back of the missile. There's kind of a logarithmic scale or multiplier that affects the nose the most, the second component the second most, and so on and so forth, to where that drag is going to consistently take less and less effect the further back in the missile the high drag component is placed. So if I set a fin back here, that is the ideal placement for a fin, because it's giving me the best turn rate, being as far as possible away from the center of mass of the missile, and it's also giving me the least drag. Now that's very useful, but the second fin is going to get less use out of that. You'll notice that if the turn rate kept constant there, I would have gotten 34 degrees per second, and I'm only getting 31.3 instead. And if I keep adding fins here, you can see that the turn rate per second is going up less and less the more fins I put towards the center. So if I really wanted a high turn rate, rather than adding fins to the back of the vehicle, my best bet is actually to add fins to the front of the vehicle. And that's going to do 2 things. 1, fins on the front of the vehicle are going to slow it down more. Usually that's a bad thing, but if you're really intent on increasing your turn rate, slowing your missile down actually helps your turn rate, because you're not traveling as far per second. Your turn rate per second does not change. So if I'm still able to turn, let's say round this to 50 degrees over the course of 1 second, but I'm traveling at 287 meters a second as opposed to, let's say, 311, that means I'm going to go roughly 22 meters less before turning that 50 degrees. So even if the fins did not slow me down here, I'm actually tightening my turning radius by slowing the missile down. So if you're trying to hit very evasive targets, having fins at the front of your missile can actually be a huge net gain. Very awkward, but yeah, that can be something that you want to do. Moving along, fins are excellent at turning, but there's another turning component in here, and that's the turning thruster. The turning thruster burns fuel. It also can't fire if you're within a very narrow cone of the target, or the target direction, I should say. So if you are attempting to turn very quickly, the turning thruster will be great. It'll help you out a ton. If you're trying to turn just a little bit, turning thruster is not even going to fire. So turning thrusters you always want to use in conjunction with fins. However, that leads us to another interesting point. The turning thruster, as the sharp-eyed among you might have noticed, when I added that from the reinforced body, if I go back to a reinforced body here, we have 311 meters a second, and if I go to a turning thruster, it's still 311 meters a second. I have not increased the drag of this missile by adding a turning thruster. This is not a high drag component, unlike the fins. So the turning thruster can be placed towards the front of the vehicle and will operate very well in conjunction with fins there. That is an excellent way of placing a turning thruster somewhere useful, because like the fins, you want this as far away from the center of mass of the missile as possible. So yeah, fins at the back, turning thrusters at the front, everyone's going to be happy. But the turning thruster gives you the ability to execute really tight turns with the missile. In this case, we've got, I go back to our short-range thrusters, so we're comparing apples to apples here. This gives us 51.8 degrees per second with 2 fins and a turning thruster. And if I even eliminate this second fin here, I'm still getting 51.1 degrees per second of turn rate with the turning thruster. So with 1 fin and a turning thruster, I can turn way faster than I could with just 2 fins. So a very useful component there. This is also excellent if you're trying to do vertically launched missiles or anything that's going to have to turn a lot right out of the launcher in order to acquire a target. Next component up is the fuel tank. The fuel tank has fuel. Yep, that's its purpose in life. It holds the gas. Really not a whole lot to say about that. So that gives you, on the small missile, 1,250 fuel. And really these numbers aren't apples to apples comparisons, but a fuel tank here gives us 10 times that amount. A fuel tank over here gives us 100 times that amount. Yeah. These missiles, as they go up in size, get pretty much multiplied by 10 in every appreciable statistic. That's just kind of a consistent thing between the missile sizes, and the fuel tank is no exception. In fact, it's probably the most obvious and straightforward multiplier that you'll see out of the entire set of differences. Moving right along, we have the one-turn component. One-turns are the first instance of something I'm going to call a partial component. That is, a component that does not take up the entire volume of space that its size would indicate. So normally this is taking up 1 slot. And you'd think, okay, this is taking up a slot. Okay, the 1 slot is 1 slot, right? I can't put a fuel component here, I can't put a warhead here, sort of. You would actually be wrong about that. The missile editor, when you have any partial components on your vehicle, gets an additional slider down here. And it lets you use free internal space for fuel, reinforcement, high explosives, or EMP. So for some type of warhead or fuel. So the one-turn component, if I look over here in the Basics tab, gives us a new stat over here, free internal volume. So I can tell immediately that this one-turn component is actually only taking up the volume of half of this slot. So if I use this for fuel, I'm going to get half of a normal fuel tank's worth of fuel, in addition to having the one-turn component in there. Very useful. And as you go up in missile sizes, the amount of, or the percentage of component that's being used goes down. So in this case, I don't need a fuel tank on this missile interceptor. I can put this one-turn component on here, and it will use up 6.2% of the actual component slot. That's not much at all. So this one-turn component is essentially giving me the ability to get almost an entire tank of fuel out of this. I don't actually need a fuel tank on here. Now, this being said, the one turn is completely useless when I've got a missile interceptor on here, because the missile interceptor does not care where the missile or the target is. It will turn to find it regardless. So one turn component not useful with a missile interceptor, or a active radar seeker, because the active radar seeker sees everything around it. But for an infrared seeker, or more importantly, a single pixel IR seeker, a one-turn component can be great. That can do exactly what you want. One thing of note about this, it's fragile. 37.5 health. Really squishy, and that's on the medium size. If I go back over here to the small size, this has 3.8 health. Yeah, that ain't going to hold up well. Next component on the list is our laser beam rider receiver. Now this is going to attempt to ride a laser beam, or a missile laser emitter. So if I was to take this laser emitter and look down it right now, you probably remember from our last tutorial that if I'm looking at a target, this beam turns green, and that indicates that I've designated a target. The laser beam rider receiver does not care about that. All it cares is, am I pointing down the line of this beam? Now that's got some advantages and it's got some disadvantages. Advantages are that it's extremely hard to spoof. Like, what am I going to do against this? If I have smoke in the way, the missile will lose the signal of the laser, but only once the missile enters the smoke. So if the target is smoking, the laser beam rider receiver might guide the missile 95% of the way to the target, and then it loses tracking for the last 5%. And vehicles that rely on smoke tend to not move real quickly because that takes them out of their own smoke cloud, so yeah, they're probably not going to be moving a whole lot in order to take advantage of losing guidance on that last 5%. The laser beam rider receiver will probably guide you to the target just fine. And there's no way of spoofing this. There's no beacons or anything else that I can use to distract the missile from following that laser beam rider receiver. So the only option, the only recourse I have against this missile is shooting it down. And that's really limiting on the target. However, what this is not good at is engaging things that will require the missile to turn a lot. It also is not good if you're not initially aiming the missile at the angle of the laser. So this is definitely a component that you want to use in conjunction with a one-turn if you think there's going to be any discrepancy between the initial launch direction of the missile and where that laser beam is pointing. Moving on, we have the Lua receiver. This is for, it operates with the Lua transceiver that you attach to a launch pad, and it allows the missile to actually receive Lua commands and turn and throttle up and down and explode based on whenever your Lua code wants the missile to do those various different operations. So without this component on the missile, you can't control the missile. Kind of a necessity. Worth noting with the Lua receiver, this is not a partial component, and it's also pretty fragile. Not as fragile as some, but it is somewhat squishy. Moving on, we have remote guidance. It essentially relies on the launching vehicle's detection, and it's going to try and aim the missile at a specific block that the AI designates, similar to how the missile laser designator receiver in the nose cone would perform. But what the remote guidance is going to specifically do is not rely on anything external to the transmission between the vehicle and the missile. So if you think of a Wi-Fi guided missile, that's the best way I can describe this. There's really no way of jamming it. There's no way of spoofing it. The only way that you can get rid of this is with or the only way you can distract this missile is with a very specific component that we'll get into in another tutorial. So there's really not a whole lot of downside to this, right? I mean, it's not on the front of the missile. It's not consuming our nose cone. It's basically impossible to spoof under normal circumstances. So what's the downside? Well, it's a little squishy, okay, but we can make up for that with reinforced bodies or various other mechanisms, okay. The real downside for this is that it requires general purpose processing power. And that jacks up the cost of your missile significantly, both in space and in resource cost. So in this case, over here we have general purpose processing power used, a new stat over in the basics tab, and that is using 0.5 general purpose processing power times 4 for the 4 different missiles. What that's saying here is that I need 2 general purpose processing cards in order to operate this one launch tube. Now, as you might recall, general purpose processing cards have to be attached to an AI. That means I have to have an AI on this vehicle, and it has to have general purpose processing cards attached to it in order to even use this missile. So even if I am manually piloting this vehicle, I still have to have this AI, and I still have to have these general purpose processing cards, even if I personally am directly aiming these missiles. Even if I want to fire these and guide them myself, I still have to have this AI mainframe and the general purpose processing cards on here. Now these cards are 100 materials each, and I need 2 of them for this one launch pad, this one small launch pad. If I move up to the medium size and use remote guidance here, I look at this. This uses 3 general purpose processing power per missile launch tube. So now I need another 3 in order to keep this missile on target. If I was to come up to this size and use that same thing here, this is going to increase it even more. I now need 18 general purpose processing power in order to guide this missile, otherwise it's going to go off target based on how much general purpose processing power it has compared to how much it needs. So that's extremely expensive. 18 of these cards is 1,800 resources, not counting the AI, and that's 18 blocks of space that I'm dedicating to general purpose processing cards. And that can be prohibitively expensive in both time and space, well, and money for that matter, when you're talking about building up a huge vehicle or a huge amount of AI components and armoring that and everything else that goes into that, just so that I can use remote guidance on that missile. So there is definitely a downside to that, and there is one counter to that, interestingly also in the AI tab, called the Signal Jammer. And this basically burns engine power and uses general purpose processing power itself in order to interfere with the remote guidance available on other missiles. So enemy missiles that are incoming could get distracted by one of these if it is close enough. So yeah, that can hurt, especially when you're paying so much in general purpose processing power just to get the missile near the target to begin with. Moving on, we have the target prediction guidance. Now, target prediction guidance and APN guidance are 2 competing components. You only want one of these. Similar to guidance, or your seekers, you only want one seeker or receiver or designator or whatever you want to call it. You only want one thing guiding your missile. Similarly, you only want one of either APN or target prediction guidance, and which one you want is going to depend largely on your launch factor or your launch frame. So in this case, I have, say, on the vehicle, this is actually facing backwards, and automatically then I know which one of these I want, because I'm never going to intentionally face the back of a vehicle towards the target. I'm going to generally not want the APN guidance here. So target prediction guidance attempts to predict where a target will be at the time the missile will intercept the target. So it's trying to predict 2 things here. 1, how long it needs to travel in order to reach the target, and 2, how far the target is going to travel and in what direction by the time the missile arrives at that point. APN guidance, by contrast, is a different type of guidance that really works better if the missile is already facing the target. Target prediction guidance doesn't really matter where the missile is pointing in relation to the target. It's just saying, hey, the target's here and it looks like it's going there, and how long is it going to take me to get there? Okay, so the target will be at about this position, aim there and go there as quick as you can. APN guidance, by contrast, is going to try and keep a consistent angle of error to the target. So if I am pointing 10 degrees away from the target, and the APN guidance thinks I'm going to impact the target in, let's say, 5 seconds, then I need to turn 2 degrees per second in order to reach the target. And that's what it's going to try and do. Now, in the APN guidance, there's a gain modifier, and the gain modifier is a multiplier on how quickly the APN will try and turn the target or the missile in order to reach the target. So, say during that 10 seconds, I need to turn 2 degrees, or rather, say during that 5-second period that I've defined, I need to turn 2 degrees per second if I was going to reach the expected intercept point. With the gain set to 2, I might turn 4 degrees in the first second, and then say, oh, now I only need to turn 6 degrees, and I've got 4 seconds to get there. So that's going to be about 1.5 degrees per second. So I'm going to turn 3 degrees this second, and now I've only got 1 degree left to turn, and I've got 3 seconds left to get there, so I need to turn 1/3 of a degree. So let's turn 2/3 of a degree because the gain multiplies by 2, and so on and so forth. So the gain is effectively telling it to turn, or kind of front load that turn, so that as you get closer towards the intercept point, if the target makes some sort of unpredictable movement, you will be able to probably catch up with that target much more effectively. All that aside, what the APN guidance is going to get you over target prediction guidance tends to oversteer a missile. So if you have a very rapidly maneuvering target that's changing its velocity a lot, target prediction guidance will try and oversteer a lot, and that may result in the target prediction guidance not actually being able to intercept the target. In other words, you might not be able to hit anything. The APN guidance, on the other hand, is much more reliable if the missile is already pointing at the target. If your missile is not pointing at the target when APN guidance kicks in, you're not going to hit the target. It's not going to actually ever make that turn, just due to the way the math works out on how APN works. So, use APN guidance on turreted missiles, or if the missiles are facing the target, use target prediction guidance in other scenarios. There are very few cases in which I would not recommend one or the other of these, because both of these are partial components. So these are both going to give me free internal volume. They're basically free on medium and large missiles, and they're not particularly high cost even on small missiles. So that's everything from the fuel and control tab. The warheads, the warheads column, by contrast, is much simpler. We have EMP warheads. These are going to impart an EMP shock into the target when they go off, and that EMP shock will basically travel along anything metallic and will try and destroy anything that's vulnerable to EMP damage. That usually includes AI components or any sort of control mechanisms, breadboards, anything that looks like it might have an electrical circuit in it. EMP warheads will try and seek that out and destroy it. And it doesn't really matter where on the vehicle the missile hits, the EMP warhead will try and jump onto a nearby piece of metal and find a route to something sensitive and electronic. Very useful if you're wanting to cripple a vehicle, especially in campaign, where sometimes it's more cost-effective to cripple a vehicle and capture it than it is to just blow it up. Speaking of blowing things up, the explosive warhead is how you blow things up. The explosive warhead will generate an explosion centered around the average point of all explosive warheads on the vehicle, or on the missile rather. So if I have 2 explosive warheads here, I'm going to generate an explosion when this missile impacts a target at the back of the missile. Now you'll note And in this particular, let's actually go over and look at the medium missiles, and let's go ahead and go look at a 5-block long medium missile. We're just going to convert all of these to reinforced bodies for now, and let's take a look at this. So if I have an explosive warhead back here, each of these components is 0.5 meter long. So in this case, I've got towards the back of the vehicle, I've got 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters, 5 meters of distance here. Now I added one explosive warhead to the back. That's going to be 4.5 meters away from the nose cone. The nose cone is going to be the thing to impact the target, so my explosion is going to be spawned 4.5 meters away from the target. This is not what you want, especially when your HE radius is 9.4 meters. Half of this explosion, more than half in fact, will dissipate harmly out into space, and you will do no damage to the target. Keep your fins back here, don't put your explosive warheads in the back. Put your explosive warheads as close to the front of the vehicle as you can possibly manage. Fragmentation warheads, by contrast, will spawn frag particles at the location of the fragmentation warhead on the vehicle. And these have a setting on them that allows you to alter the cone of the fragmented particles that come out of the warhead. That can be very useful. For instance, if I was to put a fragmentation warhead back here at the very back of the vehicle, this will allow me to shower a vehicle in frag particles, whereas if I had it right up at the front, I would be sending all of those into one very specific point on the vehicle. So the frag warhead will allow me to essentially shower a vehicle in little tiny particles that have a pretty good chance of stripping off detection components or gun barrels or really anything squishy. And that can be useful depending on your style of attack. If you're trying to disable a vehicle rather than destroy it, you might not want to blow up all the innards, and having a fragmentation warhead towards the back with a high frag cone angle lets you pretty well get away with that. Also worth noting with the frag warheads, I didn't mention this before, the tighter you make this cone angle, the less damage you get per fragment, whereas the higher it is, the more damage you get per fragment. However, the fragment count does not change. Moving on, the frag cone angle, you probably want to keep this around 60 or below, just because while the fragment damage is lower, it's going to actually hit the vehicle with most of the fragments. Another thing I like to do, the further back on a vehicle the frag warhead is, I like to tighten up the cone angle just a little bit, because frag particles don't have very much AP, they've only got 6. They will ricochet off armor at a much higher rate if they don't hit the armor straight on. So if you have them way back on the vehicle, that gives the angle more time to spread out, and things are just more likely to ricochet off various different angles on your target's armor. Try and keep the cone angle fairly tight if you're this far back on a missile. Back here, I would recommend probably no more than 5 to 10 degrees. Last component in the Warheads tab is the reinforced body. This is what I've been using for placeholders. For now, I'm going to switch over and use fuel tanks for placeholders because the reinforced bodies are what we're actually trying to see what the effects of are here. The reinforced body is more or less exactly what a thumper warhead is, except that it does not provide any drag reduction. One hard and fast rule with those, unless you're using the reinforced body just to make your missile more durable, you want to make sure your missile is going as fast as possible in order to take advantage of the impact damage per meter per second, because this is based on how fast your missile is traveling. So if you're trying to make a thump damage warhead, or a thump damage missile rather, try and keep a fair number of reinforced bodies on there, but keep in mind that you are going to want to turn your variable thruster all the way up, and you're going to want enough fuel to run that. So a little bit of a trade-off there. Moving along to our last component, or our last column of components rather, we've got the utility column. Now, utilities are awesome. These are where missiles really shine and where they really have an advantage over a lot of other weapon systems. Because a lot of other weapon systems deal damage, and that's really it. That's their purpose in life. They just hit things. Missiles, on the other hand, can offer a lot of utility and advantage, or in addition to just dealing damage. So let's just start going through these here. First on the list, I have ballast tanks. These are used generally for mines or torpedoes, and what these do is allow you to either set a specific float depth for like a mine. You could set that to float 20 meters below the surface of the water, or something along those lines, or you could set it to have buoyancy, so the mine would either float or sink, and that can be really useful. If you set these both to 0, and you have torpedo sonar and a torpedo propeller on there, essentially that means that this missile is not going to try and float to the surface like a normal missile would. So the torpedo will not always be trying to float and trying to... it will be able to steer much better. If I was trying to hit a submarine with a torpedo that did not have a ballast tank on it, I would have an extremely difficult time doing that because of the missile's natural tendency to float. Therefore, ballast tanks are super useful and very handy for any sort of naval combat. Next up are the cable drum and harpoon, and I'm going to look at these as one component. For now, the harpoon has some cable with it, and when it latches onto a target, it will attach that cable to the target, and you can use a winch on the launching vehicle in order to reel the target in, or reel yourself into the target, depending on who's heavier. So the harpoon is what actually does the hooking. The cable drum gives you extra distance on that cable. The harpoon has an amount of cable that's dependent on the actual size of the missile, so 300 meters in this case, and then I've got a cable drum that gives me 600 meters of cabling in addition to the 300 from the harpoon. Just don't attach a cable drum to a missile without putting a harpoon on it. It doesn't do anything. Moving along, we get to one of my favorite components in the missile system, the magnet. Magnets are super exciting. These basically will drag the missile to the nearest target. Note I said the nearest target, not the nearest enemy target. That's kind of the downside. These things will attempt to find anything within the magnet range. Note this is a configurable value here. And it will drag this missile as fast as it can into that target. There's also a start timer here, so we can activate the magnet after a specific amount of time has passed. That's very useful if you're dropping these as bombs to allow them to clear the vehicle and allow your bomber to get 200 meters away before your 200 meter long magnet activates. Another thing worth noting here, the magnet range is dependent on the size of missile. So a small missile over here is going to have a much smaller maximum magnet range. If I go ahead and put a magnet over here, I've got a maximum of 141 meters roughly, and over here I had 200. On the large missile, I get all the way up to a whopping 282 meters. That is enormous. That is huge. That is larger than this vehicle by like 5-6 times. So yeah, it would go from one end of this green circle to the other twice over, almost. It's enormous. It is, yeah, I cannot overstate how large of a radius that is. You must use the start time delay very carefully with this, or you will hit your own launching vehicle. Be very careful. Especially with these large missiles, that hurts a lot. We'll get into this more with various different types of missiles in the next tutorial, but magnets are just an amazing component. Also worth noting that the strength of the magnet's pull is proportional to the distance compared to its maximum range. So if I have this at 100 meters, I will get a little bit of strength at 100 meters, or a little bit of pull, and a very strong pull at 50 meters, and then at 25 meters, say, I just probably won't be able to escape it, right? If I have this at 200 meters, my strong distance is now 100 meters, and the can't escape is 50. So that expands, that keeps growing, and I'm not just initiating a hard cutoff at 100 meters if I lower this range. I'm also weakening the magnet at 100 meters out. So I tend to like to maximize this just to maximize the effectiveness of the component that I'm using. More or less, this is because essentially if I'm using a magnet, I am by definition saying none of my vehicles are going to occupy this particular spot that I'm placing this magnet missile. And if they do, then I'm going to get hit anyway. So I'm jacking up the magnet range as much as possible in order to make it more likely that I actually hit the target that I want to as well. That has the double effect of both being more likely to strike the target, and because it's more likely to strike the target, that makes it less likely that there's going to be a magnet-armed missile just floating around in the ocean the next time one of my boats drives past. That's a bad time. Trust me, I've had it happen one too many times. The next component in our list is the proximity or altitude fuse. This I don't find usually that useful, but you can set this up to trigger when the missile is within 5 meters of the target. Don't use that with explosive warheads. It's not worth it. Use that with frag warheads only. EMP warheads and explosive warheads and reinforced bodies are all totally useless if you try and detonate at any distance from the target. Explosive might deal some damage, but you're really reducing its effectiveness the further away from the target that explosion takes place. However, if you take a look at the altitude fusing here, you can set a distance below which that missile will detonate. However, that will only occur if the missile has reached that minimum altitude at least once before. So if I set a minimum altitude of 475 meters, I'm saying that I need that missile to launch up to 475 meters in altitude and then come back down. If I launch this from sea level, it has to go all the way up, almost out into space, turn around, and start heading back down before it will detonate. Next up on our list here, we have the radar and sonar buoys. Now, radar and sonar are very, very similar. Radar operates in air, sonar operates in water. They do not intermix. So I'm just going to go through these sets of 3 components kind of together. The radar buoy and sonar buoy we've talked about in our detection systems. Those allow you to detect targets using radar and sonar, using a missile that has been fired from the parent vehicle, so the parent vehicle does not get detected by passive detectors. However, this missile will be detected by those passive detectors. The radar target simulator and sonar target simulator are decoys. So these will generate a signal that other missiles will try and lock onto if they're using the corresponding type of detection. Sticky flares also fall into this category, but also have one additional feature that we'll talk about later. So the target simulators are ways of decoying targets away, or decoying enemy missiles away from your launching vehicle. Note that you want to fire these when you know an enemy missile is locked onto you. You don't want to fire these too early, because if you fire them too early, it's quite likely that a missile is going to see one of these and then lose track of it, or say your vehicle is closer to where it's initially aimed, and the decoy is not going to be nearly as effective in those cases because your target, in other words you, are right in front of the nose of the detector on the missile, and it's just going to say, hey, why would I aim off at that decoy over there? I've got a nice big target right in front of me. So yeah, try and launch decoy missiles with radar target simulators and sonar target simulators fairly close to when a missile would normally hit you. You want to give it time to steer off target, but you do want to make sure that it does see the target simulators. But you do want to make sure that it sees those target simulators. Now, I mentioned that the sticky flare has one additional feature. The sticky flare's additional feature is that it will emit heat and can stick to targets. So this is basically the target simulator for infrared seekers and single pixel IR seekers, but it can attract friendly missiles too. So if I stick a sticky flare to a target vehicle, I can then use infrared missiles to home in on that sticky flare and hit that specific target on the vehicle. That can be useful, but if you're using that, then you've already hit the target with a missile. Don't use the sticky flare, just stick an extra warhead on your missile. Everyone's going to be happier. I don't really see a whole lot of use cases for sticking a flare to a vehicle using a missile that is just going to attract more missiles. It's very finicky, it's very hard to do well, and generally you're just going to be better off adding another warhead. Moving along, we have the regulator. The regulator takes whatever your missile's lifetime is and doubles it. That's it. That's all it does. Yep, double lifetime. Moving on, the signal processor is our last component in here, and this is super, super useful. This will randomly decrease the effectiveness of decoys. Or more specifically, this will randomly reduce the effectiveness of decoy missiles, and only missiles. You can also have decoys on a vehicle, and it will not help you with those. Or you might have an entire vehicle that is a decoy. It's not going to help you with that. It also doesn't help you with a single pixel IR seeker. However, every other type of active seeker, the active radar seeker, the the torpedo sonar, the infrared seeker, the remote guidance, all of that will go a lot better if you have a signal processor on there that will keep you from getting distracted by decoys. However, you're trading a component slot for that. So you're essentially saying, I'm going to make my missile not hit quite as hard, or not hit quite as often, not be able to track as evasive of targets, but I want to not be distracted by things that go on that aren't actually my target. Alright, so that pretty much wraps this tutorial up. Next time we are going to start taking a look at actual missile designs and some of the crazy concepts I've come up with, and my friends have come up with, and that I've seen online, and yeah, we're pretty much just going to have a big old missile palooza. Hope this has been useful for you, and I hope I'll see you next time.